Near Future by Jennie Moench, a collection of science fiction short stories published by Warrior Publications. Copyright 2018 by Jennie Moench. All rights reserved, including the right of reproduction in whole or in part in any form, audio or printed.
Hello, I am Jennie Moench. I am the author of Near Future, which is a collection of short sci-fi stories. Today I'm going to read to you from the fourth story. It's called Hive Mentality. And in this story we visit the office of Councillor Dave Williamson, and we get to know 3 of his clients. And even though they are completely different from one another and they never meet one another, their lives become intertwined. The phrase hive mentality, I use that to describe when people cease to make decisions and instead just follow directions. I hope you enjoy the story.
Hive Mentality. She felt naked without her dog, vulnerable, afraid. The dog had been a small mixed breed, never fierce, never threatening, but always there and happy to go anywhere with her. Now it was gone. Sophie's ashes were in a bronze jar on her dresser at home. She liked to have them near her as she slept. Now she was sitting on a brown vinyl chair with her hands folded in her lap, waiting for her name to be called. She had found the name of this counselor online. He wasn't a psychiatrist or even a licensed psychologist. She had offered to barter with him, creating an ad for him, then posting it in several places online. Then, instead of collecting her usual fee, he would give her counseling time. Pitiful that she had to pay someone to talk to her. But that was just what it had gotten down to. She was having problems leaving her home, or even getting up in the morning. She had been wishing that one morning she just wouldn't wake up. But that hadn't happened yet. So here she was, trying to make the best of it, trying to find a reason to feel differently. She decided to give this guy a try, one last try, before she took matters into her own hand. A door opened. A man stood just inside with a tablet. "Sally Ramirez?" he asked, looking at her. Since she was the only one in the room, it was a safe guess. She nodded and quietly stood up and followed him down a short hallway, then into a blue-carpeted room. He motioned for her to have a seat in a large, comfortable chair. "Hello, Sally. I'm Dave." He reached down and shook her hand. "It's nice to finally meet you in person. Strange world we live in. We do business every day with people whom we have no idea what they look like." He noted to himself that her hand was limp and reluctant to make contact. He took a seat in a similar chair that was directly across from hers by a few feet. He was a tall, stocky man, clean-shaven, but with light brown hair, was a bit long and a little messy. "Would you like a cup of coffee or some water?" he asked. She shook her head no and returned her hands to the folded position where they had been in the waiting room. "So I want to thank you for the advertising. It's brought me a couple new clients already. How long have you been in the advertising business?" Sally explained that she had started while still in high school. It was a way to make money while working her own hours at home. In the beginning, her clients had no idea how old she was. The lack of face-to-face sales made it easy to stay anonymous. She would buy blocks of ad space on sites that she frequented. Then she'd divide up that space between clients that she solicited online. Payment was made electronically. No one knew who anyone was anymore anyway. "Have you ever visited a counselor before?" She shook her head no. "What made you decide to?" She adjusted herself in her chair to get up her nerve to answer. "Well, I live alone and don't have anyone to talk to," she explained. Dave nodded and regarded her with concern. "You don't have any family?" She glanced away nervously, then pushed herself back into her chair. "No." This was beginning to look like something that Dave handled regularly. "Do you still have your parents?" he asked carefully. She looked around herself uncomfortably. She knew that she was going to have to answer these kinds of questions to explain herself, but it wasn't easy for her. My mother died 3 years ago. She and my father weren't married. He was actually married to someone else, so I never got to know him. He lives in Chicago. Dave nodded. No siblings? I don't know. Grandparents? No. She shook her head, then brightened slightly. But I do have an Aunt Kathy in Dearborn, and her daughter Eve used to stay with me, but she moved back with her mom. Dave leaned forward in his chair. Sally, when was the last time you spoke out loud to anyone? Sally looked away, thinking about the question. I'm not sure. I message people for work and my online friends, but to talk out loud to a person, well, I'm not sure. Dave made a note in his pad, then decided to change to a more comfortable topic. That's okay, don't worry about it. Where did you go to school? Sally relaxed a little. I graduated from an online college. Before that, I was homeschooled by my mother as well as attending public school for some classes. She then began an explanation of how her mother liked the critical thinking and natural science courses, but loathed the use of calculators for math and the lack of classical literature in the public school curriculum. The conversation began to flow for her. It was kind of a release. She even managed to tell him about how the original Pinocchio fairy tale would frighten her. It's more of a story that you would read around a campfire at night rather than at bedtime, she explained. The hour-long appointment went by quickly. Sally decided that she liked Dave, the counselor, and would stick around for their next appointment. After his client left the office, Dave became busy recording his thoughts on the session. The case was similar to many of his cases. It boiled down to one word: isolation. The constantly connected world they lived in was a lie. It was apparent to him that online connection was no substitute for real-life connection. Virtual reality, the internet, they had their places in the world, but neither was a replacement for human-to-human contact. We are a social animal, he would often write. The walk home was pleasant. Walking past a glass front building, she caught a glimpse of herself and noticed that she was smiling. She nearly didn't recognize herself. What do I want? She asked the girl in the glass. Tacos and a walk along the river, came the answer. There was a taco stand near the intersection where the cobblestone path that followed the banks of the river and the city street intersected. She paid for her tacos at the outdoor counter, then carried her little cardboard box to a nearby bench to eat and watch the water flow. It was a nice day. The banks of the river were littered with people of all types, some of them with their dogs. It made her a little sad to think of how much more fun it would be to share her tacos with Sophie. When she had finished eating, she threw her little box into a recycling bin. She noticed that some of the people were sitting on the grass barefoot, so she took off her shoes and walked with them in her hand. The grass was lush and green. Nowadays it was unmowed, but the new variety of grass only grew to a maximum length of 5 inches, so it required less energy to keep it looking and feeling luxurious. A few dandelions were popping out here and there, but no one seemed to mind. There were a few kayaks swiftly paddling by. Then as she rounded a bend, she noticed a large pontoon pulling to the side of the river to pick up more passengers. It was a party boat, with a bar and a band playing. Their solar lights were beginning to slowly glow, a bluish color as the sun was setting. She wondered about what it would be like to be one of those passengers. They were a lively bunch. Everyone looked so happy, so friendly and talkative. She wished she was one of them. In her fantasy, one of them noticed her and called her over to join them, but no one in real life did. Her walk home was a little more melancholy. She had returned her shoes to her feet and finished her journey into a residential area just outside the city limits. Her small 2-bedroom house was in an area that she had known her whole life. She continued to rent it as her mother had before her. The little yard was hidden by a blanket of weeds in the drive. sat a small electric transport that needed to be plugged in by way of an extension cord that ran into her kitchen window when needed. She didn't drive it much, but it comforted her to know that it was available, even though a bit unreliable. There were still ugly bars on her windows, but a quality security system that recognized her as she stepped up to the porch. She pressed her index finger on the pad outside the door that allowed her to open it. Inside there was a familiar musty smell. She had long ago cut back on her cleaning. After her cousin had moved out, there was no one left to impress. Even the dog pillow next to the door had a layer of dust on it. She kicked off her shoes and threw herself onto a gray quilted couch. The discussion she had earlier with Councillor Dave had caused her a rush of memories, things that she had forbidden herself to think about. Growing up with an independent-minded mother, militant even. They were never wealthy or even close to middle class, but her mother had always worked and provided them with a roof and meals without help. Sally was proud of that. She only wished that she had told her mother so. Kids don't notice until they are thrust into fending for themselves, she comforted herself. Surely her mother knew that, wherever she was in the cosmos. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table a few feet away with her mother and a school tablet. They would spend hours discussing her critical thinking assignments. Her mother was a big proponent of the marketing classes that every grade in public school was required to take. After the cyber attack, before she was born, there was a big push by a newly elected president to free minds from the barrage of propaganda that had been plaguing the country. Legislation to curb misinformation was impossible to enforce. Big money kept finding new ways to circumvent the rules. Often just paying the fines was the best way for them economically. So it became evident that the only solution was to educate the masses in public schools. An online curriculum was created. Lessons were introduced to address new forms of marketing. Educators were encouraged to add new lessons to the online database as they encountered new strategies of deception. Then the same lessons were used by the students to analyze political speeches. A class of deprogrammed children grew into voting adults. Now major corporations were being forced to turn to a new marketing strategy: the truth. Sally was proud of her mother for being part of the revolution of enlightenment. Her mother had truly helped make the world a better place, but now she was gone. Sally wished so much that she could talk to her. The idea that maybe one day she could was propelling her to make the ultimate decision, but before that she thought she might keep her appointment with Councillor Dave. Dave the counselor was waiting in his private office to greet the new client for their first appointment. He opened the waiting room door to discover a well-dressed older man with a silver-knobbed walking stick already waiting. The tall, slim man looked comfortable. With a slight smile, he nodded when Dave called his name. "Oliver Wayne?" The man stood up and reached for Dave's hand. "Ollie," he corrected. His smile radiated a gentleness that seemed to calm Dave down. He decided right away that he liked the old man. "David Williams, but I prefer Dave." "Well then, Dave it is," Ollie declared, following his new friend. After both men were comfortable in opposite chairs, Dave asked, "So what brings you here on this rainy afternoon?" he asked, noting that Ollie had made the appointment himself. "Well, I'm humoring my grandson. He thinks I'm getting senile. Or, well, I should say he hopes I'm getting senile." Ollie chuckles at his own expense. "Why do you think that?" "Actually, I don't want to prejudice you, so let's get your opinion first." Dave shrugged. "Okay, sounds fair. How about if I get a few personal details, like, down at the nearly empty record on his tablet, to the first unanswered question. "Ah, are you married?" "Widower. For 8 years now." "Sorry for your loss," David expressed softly. "How about family? Any children?" "Well, yes, I have a son, Albert, and his wife Sandy, and their son Steve." "So, is it Steve that you wanted to talk to me about?" Ollie nodded. "Yes, he's 25 now and thinks that he knows what is best. I want you to make the decision." "That's a lot of responsibility." Dave didn't know if he wanted to get involved in a family squabble. The whole thing was making him uncomfortable. He looked up at a very confident Ollie and adjusted himself in the chair. Okay, what part of the country are you from? Ollie bumped his walking stick on the floor. Why, from right here. Born and raised. Then I raised my family here, too. It's a good place. Dave nodded. Could I ask you what you do for a living? He noted that Ollie was a cash customer. Well, I started out as a carpenter, did that for 5 or 6 years. Then Albert came along, and I was worried that I wasn't around enough. I wanted to find a way to stay home with him, so I started my own business out of my home. Best decision I ever made. Dave nodded in appreciation. That's wonderful. What do you do? Well, I was watching an old Western movie, and I noticed that back in the day, people would bring new neighbors baskets of baked goods and welcome presents. I liked the idea. So I started welcome baskets. Dave was a bit surprised. Welcome baskets, he repeated. Yes, you've probably never heard of it unless you're a realtor or a local business that participates. Dave shook his head. So the way it works is that I contact businesses from the area for free stuff and coupons. Then I, or rather Susie's Flowers, arranges it in a basket and delivers them to the realtor offices. Oh yeah, I've been contacted to participate, but I wasn't sure if it was ethical for me. I use other methods to find clients. How about you? Do you make money with it? The businesses that participate also give me a fee. Okay, that makes sense. So you are helping local businesses advertise to people who move to the area. Great idea. I thought so. I started out with one realty office. They loved the free gift to their clients, and now they were able to make connections with other businesses in the area. When other realty offices found out, they asked me to supply them. So I just kept growing. Now I supply baskets to realty offices across the country. Dave was impressed. But how are you able to supply them from across the country? It's about being a good organizer and consistency. I use local salesmen to find businesses to fill the baskets and pay them strictly on commission. Never even met most of them. But I have an app that they use to find out what orders from what offices need baskets. Then I locate a florist that is nearby to arrange the baskets and make the deliveries to the realty office. Dave nodded in appreciation. And the beauty of it is anyone who has a connection to the web can work for me. There are poor single mothers in far-flung parts of the country that have figured out the system and make a good living from it. I pay their commissions electronically. Everyone is happy. Marvelous, Dave was impressed. So, you are still working? Ollie sighed. Yes, all I do now is monitor the orders and make sure they are filled. I've come a long way from the beginning. I'd do it all over in the same way. I love being home with my son. We'd play outside together when he got out of school. Ollie became lost in reminiscing. My favorite business was the one that I had with my son that we started when he was 7. We bought some chickens and built a house for them, complete with a solar panel to keep them warm in the winter. He chuckled. Those were the most pampered chickens ever. No antibiotics, no chicken feed, just corn. No salmonella, so no need to refrigerate the eggs. Albert would deliver them to the neighbors in baskets that I contributed. And they would set the empty baskets out on their porch, and then once a week he'd leave an envelope for them to pay him. It was his business. He laughed at the memory. That chicken house was as clean as a house that we lived in. Albert named every one of those chicks. In the morning, I'd help him gather the eggs. It was a great life. Everyone was happy. Dave nodded. Dave noted that he used the same phrase. Is it important to you that everyone is happy? Of course, Ollie maintained. That's what makes us alive, helping each other. Does your son still live nearby? No, he moved to California. His wife writes computer apps, works in AI. She's a smart one. My son has a charter fishing business. I'm real proud of both of them. What about your grandson Steve? He's got himself an apartment downtown. He moved here to work for me. Well, really to learn the business. I think he wants to take it over. Ollie lost a bit of his cheer. How does it make you feel? Ollie thought about it for a minute. He's smart enough. I just worry that he wants to take shortcuts. I'm afraid that he's not as vigilant about taking care of the details as I am. And to be honest, I think he just wants to resell it for a one-time fistful of money. So you are worried for your business? But wouldn't it be nice to retire? Yes, it would be nice to retire. I just worked too damn hard building the business up from nothing, literally nothing. Now it's worth a pretty penny. And even though I don't have any employees, there are several people who depend on my business for their income. Not to mention the other businesses that have been using me to advertise their businesses for just as long. It's been a good deal for everyone involved. I just hate to see it all disappear. You don't think your grandson is capable? No, I don't know if he ever will be. He's different values. Ollie shook his head as his voice trailed off. Besides, I don't do it anymore. I just kind of oversee everything. Nothing strenuous. Dave decided to change the subject, something more pleasant. They talked about Ollie's childhood. Dave was trying to determine if his grandson had any basis to declare the old man senile, but he couldn't see it. They closed out the session by scheduling another appointment for the following week. Dave explained that there were a few tests that he could try to determine his mental abilities. It was agreed that Ollie would take the test during his next appointment. Later, Dave was a little disappointed when he opened the door to his waiting room and noticed it was empty. He was expecting to see yet another new client waiting for him, Eric Gunderson. The appointment had been made yesterday. Dave tapped the tablet in his hand off, then decided to leave the doorway open and wait in his business office in case Mr. Gunderson was late, rather than a no-show. He had finished off his office work, so he decided to take advantage of the unexpected reprieve by starting a new book that Ollie had recommended, Crime and Punishment. It was his first foray into Russian literature. He had just begun to get interested in the novel when he heard a reception room door open. He set his reading device on his desk, then noted the time. His new client was 23 minutes late. "Hello, Mr. Gunderson?" Dave asked as he entered the waiting room. Who had entered was wearing an electric blue fitted suit. The legs were tapered, showing off a pair of highly polished black shoes. He was of an average height, but with his black curly hair piled up on top of his head, he appeared rather tall. Dave noted that the tips of those black curls were also colored in the same blue color so as to match his suit. He was wearing a pair of smart AR glasses and clear yet iridescent lenses wrapped partially around his head. There was a white rose in his lapel. "Yes, I'm Eric Gunderson." His voice was thin yet confident, like the rest of him. He extended his hand. Mr. Gunderson looked down at it, but then back up at Dave's face with a look that implied that he didn't shake hands. Dave respected that, and immediately withdrew his hand, giving a friendly nod of the head instead. "I'm glad you could make it. Did you have problems finding the office?" "No, just some business that went over. I've had a busy day." "Well, come in, and we can get to know one another. This way." He led the new client to his office. The man hesitated before sitting in the overstuffed chair. He seemed to be looking it over first, but soon they were both seated across from one another. Dave was looking at his tablet. "So, Eric, I see that you've completed the questionnaire already. Seems that you are an entrepreneur. Married for 5 years, no children. Was there anything particular that you've come here to discuss?" Eric pulled in a breath. "Well, actually, my wife is the one who wanted me to come. She just has a problem with technology, you know, one of those people who can't keep up, while I, on the other hand, love it. I really think she is one of those who should be wasting her time here, not me." Dave nodded and tapped out a note. "So, is there something in particular that she has a problem with?" Eric shook his head. "Everything. She thinks that I spend too much time in VR, and that we need more live friend dates." He suddenly broke off from the conversation and seemed to be reading something that was being displayed on the inside of his lens. "I'm sorry, important business call. I need to take this. Do you mind?" He looked up, expecting the counselor to leave the room. The unspoken request took Dave by surprise, but he complied and shut the door behind him. The call went on for several minutes. Dave hovered around the closed door until Mr. Gunderson typed out a message to him, letting him know that he should return. The rudeness didn't escape Dave, but he was just used to dealing with a variety of people and tried not to be offended easily. So, everything is okay to proceed now? He asked meekly. Yes, for now. Important business. New clients are always difficult. Dave took a seat. So what is it that you do exactly? Primarily real estate. I buy up commercial property and then lease it to businesses as well as sell stock in my business as a whole, he explained, looking around rather proud of himself. How long have you been doing this? Eric pulled in a thoughtful breath. Well, I began buying commercial property 2 years ago, but I've just started selling shares of my business for the last year. That is where the money is, he explained with confidence. Dave didn't like the guy, but he was determined not to let it show. So I noticed your smart lenses. How does that work out for you? It's everything, Eric gushed. It lets me communicate with anyone, anywhere. It's the latest in bone technology. The sender's end of the conversation is completely within my head. No one else can hear it. Dave made an impressed sound and nodded his head. Can you communicate without a voice back? Well, yes, but that technology isn't perfected yet. I usually turn that feature off. You can't be sure of what unintentional messages you might send. Also, sometimes the words are garbled. That end of the technology seems to need improvements, he conceded. But the truth of it was that the technology was too good. By reading the muscles in the jaw, words could be detected. The problem was unintentional thoughts that were vocalized as well. You said that your wife wanted you to visit me? Could you explain the problem? Mr. Gunderson filled the rest of his shortened session explaining his wife's complaints. They needed to meet the next week. Later, the weather was damp and rainy. Sally wore her rain hat and boots to her appointment. The walk was still pleasant. It was nice to get out of the house. She noticed a man with a visor exiting the small doorway as she approached. He was wearing a pair of waterproof smart pants and activated a clear umbrella hat just before stepping out from under the awning. Nothing unusual. Just a typical businessman forced out of doors to walk to his waiting transport because the little office building couldn't afford a drive-through. Once inside, she pressed the elevator, then located the stairs and walked the 3 floors to Dave's office, a bit like her own home, but with a popular tropical scent that wasn't completely successful in masking the first odor. She sat in an empty waiting room in her usual fashion, with her hands folded on her lap. After several minutes, Councillor Dave let her in. Today I'd like to talk more about your mother, if you don't mind, he began. Sally nodded. It sounds like the two of you were close. Do you know where she came from? Sally explained that her mother was from Chicago but moved to Michigan shortly after she was born. They had lived a short time in Detroit, but Sally was too young to remember much of anything else but life in the little house a couple miles away. Her mother was political growing up. Sally had attended many marches and political rallies. She even met the president once before he was elected. Her mother was a big supporter of all things social medicine, social education, social welfare, and championed the issues of the minimum income for all. Unfortunately, she didn't live to see the last part become law. Dave appeared to be genuinely interested. What do you suppose motivated her? It was the cyber attack. She was a child when it happened, but her family was one of the last to get their power back. She said that they had to get water from a nearby creek in the summer and burn wood to keep warm in the winter. The cyber attack was a common euphemism for something that happened 50 years prior. The country was getting over a very disruptive political cycle. A far-left candidate from a newly created socialist party was elected on the platform of better public school education, socialized medicine, and renewable energy. It was to be paid for with cuts to military spending. The country became even more divided. Misinformation was causing more chaos, sending the country into disarray. Russia was being punished for helping propel the campaign of lies. All their citizens were banned from entering the United States. This meant that the billionaire oligarchs were unable to use the United States as their playground. This and barring the import of Russian oil infuriated the Russian government. A cyber attack was launched on the USA electrical grid. The Russians had covertly gained access, and on one fateful day, they created a power surge that overwhelmed the entire system. It blew up appliances and even zapped appliances that were connected to surge protectors. Small electrical fires erupted everywhere, some of them sprouting up into huge fires, even in places that had never seen wildfires before. Communications quickly went down, and since the landline technology had become in disrepair from lack of use, buildings that housed banks of computers where internet data was stored were soon out of petrol for generators, since governments were confiscating it for emergency use for hospitals, shelters, and government buildings. The blackout that happened within minutes, the entire country was without electricity. Years later, when the human toll was calculated, it was the largest loss of civilian life ever recorded from an attack, and yet not a single shot was fired. The whole mess took years to recover from. Our present response was to step up the plans to replace the dependence on fossil fuels to renewables. For most of the country, becoming energy independent became patriotic. The cyber attack was the incident that pushed most of the country into the age of clean energy. Most, but there were still a few holdouts in the southern coal country. Their cries to double down on the fossil fuel were successful for a time in a few states, but as the years passed, it became obvious that they were backing the wrong technology. Most of those original states had already changed course, but there were still a few holdouts. "Are you politically active?" Dave asked. "Not as much as my mother, but I belong to a few online groups." "Do you ever attend rallies?" "Not in person. I watch online. I helped organize a few." "Why don't you consider getting personally involved? It might be a way of meeting like-minded people." Sally thought about it for a minute. The meeting for a peace group that she was especially active in were live-streamed. She enjoyed watching and talking, but she never took the piece of tape off the camera on her monitor. They meet in Lansing." "It's not that far. Do you have a transport?" "Yeah, I hate having to be somewhere at a specific time." Her voice trailed off. "I think that's an excuse." Sally had to concede that it was. "How about if I made an assignment?" She just looked at her counselor and considered her promise to try. "Okay." She nodded, talking to herself as well. They continued discussing politics under her ambitions for the peace group. By the time she left, she was almost anxious for the meeting in Lansing. Then to visit Dave again to tell him what happened at the meeting would be a good reason to stick around for their next appointment. Eric Gunderson stepped out of his transport and into the lobby of a building where he lived. It was an impressive new building with 10 floors of luxury condos. They were extravagantly priced as well, but fortunately for Eric, his father-in-law owned the building. He was scanned to verify that he was indeed the resident of the building as he entered an elevator that took him to his 9th floor unit. He tipped his glasses up so that his identity could again be verified by this eye scan before the door of his unit opened. The first thing he encountered when he entered the condo was his wife's angry voice. "That dog shit on the floor again," she shrieked. "There was no note on the door, no video. They better not be charging us. I want you to call them right now." She was in the bathroom off the master bedroom, washing her hands with a variety of cleaning products. Eric quietly made his way through the white-on-white rooms that, by the way of his app that he had customized, were everything but white. His augmented reality lenses revealed to him a rich burgundy carpet, gold trim around the emerald green walls that were covered with rare and ancient paintings. The ceilings in his living room appeared high and were adorned with the scenes from the Sistine Chapel. I promise," he assured her while mocking a kiss on her cheek. She never made eye contact, preoccupied with her task as he continued. "I went to the counselor today. You were right. It was nice to discuss things with him. We have another appointment next week." "Okay, but call a dog walker." Eric stepped away from his wife and onto their balcony, where he shut the glass doors behind him and stepped to the edge for a good view of the city below him. Before he contacted the dog walker, soon he was having an awkward conversation with a man whose income was derived by caring for others' pets. I'm sorry, sir, but I've been walking your dog for a month and a half and haven't been paid. Eric responded in his most effective, irritated voice, I told you my company pays its invoices monthly. You are just going to have to wait for the next pay period. But it's been more than a month, the man retorted meekly. Eric made an exasperated sound. Well, they always hold one payment back. You'll get paid at the end of this month. That will pay for last month, he explained. But why can't you pay me and then let your company refund you the money? I can't stand here any longer and explain to someone like you how finances work. Just be there tomorrow to walk the damn dog or you won't get paid anything ever. Eric disconnected the call. The whole dog thing had become too much of an issue for him. He noticed a small whine and followed it to a cage that was near the far side of the balcony that held a medium-sized brown dog of contention. Isabel used to carry the pup in a special bag with her everywhere. The animal was a cute little toy for her, but then it grew too large for its puppy bag, so it was left at home for most of the day. When she had first noticed the growth spurt, she had tried to feed the poor thing less in hopes of stemming off the problem, but against her wishes the cute puppy became a gangling, thin dog. Eric stepped back inside from the balcony. Isabella, dear, I think maybe it's time to get rid of the dog. His wife stopped with her hand washing and considered his pronouncement for a moment, but then remembered what a fuss she had made at adopting the animal in the first place. Her friends had cheered her on, especially when she declared that her new pet would be from a shelter, a rescue dog. No, we can't. Just be sure that the dog walker is here tomorrow. The next day, Dave was surprised to find another new client on his schedule, Steve Wayne. He decided to call him to be sure that there wasn't a conflict. Mr. Wayne, I see you are on my schedule for an appointment. Are you Oliver Wayne's grandson? Yes. I'm afraid I can't speak to you about your grandfather. It would be unethical. Well, he started, my grandfather may not be completely honest with you. That is why I wanted to meet with you about him. His voice was a bit high, and it sounded like he was somewhat excited. I'm sorry if your appointment was to discuss your grandfather. You don't understand, Steve interrupted. I'm interested in talking to you. I just want an appointment. My grandfather was impressed with you, and I want to talk to you myself. I've been under a lot of stress. Dave didn't buy it. There was something deceitful going on. I'm sorry, Mr. Wayne. I'm afraid you need to see a different counselor. I have a few names for you if you need a referral. The phone went dead. Dave looked down at the thing in his hand. It was working. Steve had hung up on him. Or maybe his phone died. Dave tried to reason with himself. Phone on his desk, then stared at it a moment, waiting for it to ring, but it didn't. He said aloud to himself. Today Eric was dressed in a deep violet suit, same style, but with a live white carnation in his lapel. And the tips of his updo were now the violet color of his suit. He was walking down a city sidewalk after making an in-person examination of a piece of property that he thought had promise. As he walked, he was composing a message to his father-in-law, expounding on the virtues of the property and its potential. So it was as he was thus preoccupied that two youths with a disruptor noticed him. Disruptors were illegal, handheld devices that render the user of the device to be invisible to augmented reality, or AR. The device looked like a small wand with a knob at the top that felt as though it held liquid inside its plastic exterior. It came with a holster and belt, whose length was studded with small round cameras. Since AR lenses actually displayed a video of the reality in front of you, someone wearing a disruptor was shielded by a large oval that covered their body. Then when the device sensed the waves emitted by the AR cameras, the small cameras on the opposite side of the wearer's belt would fill the oval with footage, so people who wore AR lenses, like Eric Gunderson, were vulnerable to sneak attacks. The youths followed Eric as he turned down a less congested alleyway, where he stopped and summoned his transporter. The two teenagers waited silently on either side of him as the three were expecting the vehicle. Eric was poking at a monitor in front of him that only he could see, still composing the important message to his father-in-law. When the transporter appeared from the opposite end of the alley, stopped, then opened its sliding doors that its owner might board the silver ship. That was when one of the youths punched him hard in the midsection. Eric bent over, startled and astonished, unable to comprehend what was happening to him. The other youth removed the AR lenses from his face just before his accomplice, who was holding a bat, swung the thing as hard as he could, using the back of Eric's head as its target. Eric was knocked unconscious. They jumped over him and into his transporter. Then one of them pushed his slumped-over body out of the way of the doors with his foot before slamming it shut. They jubilantly explored their surroundings as the thing sped away. The gadget and lenses and well-stocked bar. This was the beginning of their all-night party. An hour later, Eric slowly recovered his senses, finding himself stretched out near a cement wall. His clothes were soiled, but even more troubling for him was the absence of his glasses. They were his only communication device. He looked around himself while holding the back of his sore head, hoping that they had fallen off his face and would be nearby, but they weren't. Then it occurred to him that whoever it was that attacked him had most likely made off with his transport as well. He stood dazed in the middle of the asphalt, not sure what to do. He walked with an unsteady gait to the end of the alley and squinted into the sunlight sidewalk from his naked eyes. People walked past him as though he were invisible. The fact that he was noticing them was somewhat new. He realized that reality had become like virtual reality for him. It was a strange sensation. Having no way to contact help was alarming. The fact was that he didn't even know the way to his home. Slowly he realized that what he needed to do was to reach out and ask a stranger for assistance. The idea was an insult to his ego, but unless he could locate a police officer, what choice did he have? He searched the faces of the pedestrians, but the only ones who would make eye contact was a scruffy-looking elderly man. "Something wrong?" the old man asked with concern, addressing the confused and tattered man. Yes," Eric answered as he stepped up to the gentleman. "I've been robbed. Could you please call the police for me?" The old man raised his hand to his ear, indicating that he couldn't hear, so Eric stepped closer than he wanted. The old man was unshaven, his gray hair was messy, and his clothes needed to be washed, but Eric could see a silver communicator around his neck. He pointed at it. "Could you please summon the police for me? I've been robbed," he explained in the slow, loud words. The old man nodded and squeezed the alarm. "Okay, now you just stay here beside me." The man pointed to a bench. He started the slow journey to it himself while holding the middle of his back. Eric instinctively reached out and held the man's arm steady as they both moved to the bench. The old man looked up at him with cloudy eyes and a smile. Eric felt uncomfortable touching the old man, but at the same time he found himself needing him, so he quietly sat down side by side. They sat facing the street. He was reminded of his own grandfather, who had died in a nursing home a few years ago when he was too busy to attend a funeral. This was the first time that he felt a twinge of guilt about it. It wasn't long before a police car pulled up next to them. Eric stood up as soon as he saw the flashing lights a few blocks down the street. But before the car came to a stop, he noticed the old man next to him again. He had something in his hand that he was pressing into Eric's hand. Eric opened his fingers and accepted the gift as the old man turned and hobbled away. Eric opened his hand to find a $10 bill. The meeting in Lansing. The meetings were held in the basement of a community shelter. Sally's car stopped in front of a set of double doors in a very boxy-looking brown building. She got out with her tablet in hand. A slender man that she recognized from the videos walked briskly ahead and opened the door for her. She smiled and said thanks, almost expecting him to recognize her. She knew who he was. His name was Alvin. "Are you here for the meeting?" he asked. She nodded shyly. Great, I'll show you where it is. My name is Alvin, by the way. He offered her his hand. She took it and wanted to explain to him that they already knew one another, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, she quietly followed him down a set of stairs and to another door with a peace sign taped to it. The group had adopted it as their symbol. No words are necessary was actually her idea. It pleased her to see that it was being used. It made her think of her mother. There was a coffee dispenser and an odd assortment of clean cups. She used one of them to pour herself a cup of black coffee, then took a seat at a long table that was one of several arranged in a circle. The video camera that took the footage that she had been watching every week for the last several years was located in a corner near the ceiling. It seemed kind of strange to her that that little box was her connection to the group. Yet at that moment she was anonymous. She sat with her tablet in front of her, watching the room fill with familiar faces. By the time the meeting was to start, more than half of the chairs were filled. Alvin called the meeting to order and asked everyone to give their name and the reason for being a part of the group. Sally waited patiently for her turn, practicing what she was about to say. Sally Ramirez, I'm here because I think we need to stop the rich and powerful from using the poor as cannon fodder. Everyone clapped. Are you the same Sally that helped me organize the last march? Alvin asked from his seat across from her. She nodded meekly. Nice to finally meet you. Thanks for all the help. You really got the word out. Were you at the march? No, I had to work, she lied. Well, unfortunately, I'm sure we will need to organize another one, Alvin consoled her. She remembered the last march that she had participated in was with her mother 4 years ago. For the following year, she had used her mother's illness as an excuse. It was. For the next 3 years, she had been justifying her lapse in participation by helping promote the group online. Now the truth was that she didn't go outside much anymore, not since Sophie died. The meeting covered current events, focusing on stories of interest to the pacifists. Then they discussed which government agencies and public figures that they needed to be targeting with messages. After a lively discussion, someone mentioned a local church that was feeding the poor and asked for volunteers. Sally was interested, but refrained from raising her hand. Then came the discussion of their next planned demonstration that was to be held outside the governor's state of address. Again, Sally wanted to raise her hand, but didn't. When the business was finished, she was the first one up and out of the room. She chased herself as she walked out of the door and summoned her car. Why did she even go? For all she did, she could have done it more efficiently at home. She was just stepping inside her car when the door of the building burst open and Alvin called to her, Hey, thanks for coming. She stopped and stood with the transport door open. You're welcome. I had a nice time. Alvin walked closer to her. Good. You'll have to come again. In fact, maybe we could get together before the next meeting and talk about promoting for the next march, if you don't mind. Sally nodded. How about a coffee shop? I'll message you and figure out a time and place, he offered. Sally nodded again and stepped inside her vehicle. They waved to each other as it drove off. Alvin was tall and thin. He had shaggy dark hair and a beard. He also had kind eyes. Sally thought he was cute. She suddenly felt tingly and happy. A big smile crossed her face. She wondered if he was attached. A couple days later, Dave noticed another new client on his schedule, John Smith, sounding a bit fishy, but there were probably many men with that name, he reasoned. Sally's advertisements had brought him several new clients. The appointment was for that afternoon. At the appointment time, he did find a young man sitting in his waiting room. John Smith, he asked. The man nodded. Could you please come this way? Mr. Smith followed Dave into his office. He was of a slight build, wearing an expensive suit and hat. So what brings you here today? Dave asked once they were both seated across from one another. Well, I've been under a lot of stress, the man started in a familiar voice. You see, I have a very profitable business, lots of stress. He leaned forward in his chair, their eyes locked. Then Dave shook his head. If this is about another client of mine, I'm afraid you've wasted your time. Dave started to stand up so that he could show Mr. Smith out. My grandfather's company is worth millions and has the potential to make much more, the young man stated firmly, keeping his place in the chair. I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, Dave was irritated. You need to leave. It's worth $100,000 to me if you could make sure that he fails those competency tests tomorrow. Dave paused. The amount of money surprised him. No, I'm not interested. He was standing over Mr. Smith, who was still firmly planted in his chair. You have to leave now. If you could help me become my grandfather's guardian, I'll make it $250,000. Dave was astonished by his boldness. No, I won't be a part of this. It's highly unethical and illegal. Dave pointed towards the door. Now, I want you to leave. Now. The young man glared at the counselor, then stood up. He turned towards Dave. This won't end here. My grandfather needs to see a real doctor, not just some counselor that he picked up from an online ad. I'll handle this one way or another. Dave followed him out, locking the door behind him. There was something creepy about that kid. Dave's first guess was psychopath. He was right. Eric drove one of the very newest transport models. It was low and sleek, barely tall enough to stand in, but the sleeker design, with most of its weight low to the ground, greatly improved its road-hugging abilities and also allowed more weight and resources to be used. The luxurious interior with its stocked bar, complete with ice and draft beer. There were no monitors, none were needed, as it did have a projector that could use the entire interior area as a viewing screen, if the captain elected. The AI in the driving program was also sleeker and more responsive in adjusting speed for even minimal changes in driving conditions. It could be faster than even old-style manual driving machines, if the captain of the ship wanted to enforce the lowering of the safety time that the vehicle should maneuver. That would cause it to go even faster. So it was with great disappointment that he was forced to accept an older, slower model while his was being repaired. The police found it 2 days after it was stolen, well used, then left on the side of the road. The youths had drunk all the alcohol, slept in it, pissed in it, then disembarked, forgetting that as the door closed behind them, they had no way of opening it back up. The lenses were long gone, but Eric had acquired new ones the same day as his others were stolen. Being without them was intolerable. When he was making his selection online, he also inquired about security software. There didn't seem to be anything that could detect a disruptor yet, but there was some interesting options. He did find himself purchasing a rubber app. This was a kind of software that could detect someone scanning you. When it did, the invisible scanning waves would bounce off you and exchange your information with the person nearest you, without the person with the scanning device knowing the difference, thereby shielding your name and personal information. What the consequences were for the unfortunate person next to you didn't seem to be consequential to Eric. He just liked the idea that bill collectors and process servers would be confused. The practice of scanning people was still technically illegal, but the practice had become so commonplace that no one could stop it. It started years ago with software that could identify people caught on video committing crimes. Databases of mugshots were routinely used to identify criminals in the act. But then, when facial identification was used as a password, the general public paid to be included. And now their personal information was readily available as attached to their personal identification numbers. That was their own face, making cell phones the first widespread scanning devices. Eric came home to his wife being entertained by an interactive hologram. It was an up-and-coming fashion designer explaining to her his most recent line while displaying the garments on a faceless white model with her body. He frowned, wondering how much it was going to end up costing him. But with the most dashing smile he could summon, he moved behind her as she was sitting on the couch and actually touched her cheek with his lips. She pulled away. "What? I'm busy." But darling, it's Friday and I wanted to show you the new apps I have to go with my new glasses. He tried to say this in a flirty way. He was also hoping to distract her from making another purchase. She turned towards him in an annoyed manner, but her gaze did hesitate on his face momentarily, just enough to be taken as a sign of interest. Maybe in a bit, she snapped, before returning her attention to the designer. Ah, success, he ruminated before retreating to his master bath to freshen up. He couldn't remember ever having sex with his wife without them both wearing lenses. They each had favorite AR programs that would exchange the other's body for a favorite celebrity. Everyone did it. And their partners never needed to know who the man or woman was that their partner had been fucking. On more than one occasion, he had Isabella resembling Marilyn Monroe. Bone technology was wonderful, since only he was the one that could hear Howard Hughes cheering him on from a gilded throne next to the bed. It made sex an adventure. After a quick shower, he threw on a fluffy white robe, then turned the water spigot on their made-for-two bathtub. He added some sweet-smelling crystals, then peeked into the living room as the tub was filling. His wife was still on the couch, being entertained by the hologram, but he did notice her glance his way as he was peeking at her. This encouraged him to find a cold glass of sparkling wine and offer it to her where she was sitting. He bent close to her ear and whispered that he'd be waiting in the bath for her. She didn't reply or even meet his eyes, but he could tell she'd be joining him soon. He made himself comfortable in the tub with the rest of the bottle of wine on a small table nearby. There, by the bottle, was also a small metal tube with his favorite narcotic in a smokeless oil form. He wasn't a drug addict, but the hallucinogenic made his wife's high-pitched voice more tolerable, especially when he paired it with the body of Gigi Lepew, his new favorite starlet that he had chosen from the list in the new program that came with his new lenses. As he was laying back, eyes closed, his fantasy was interrupted when Gigi carefully glided her foot into the water beside him. Her body was fashionably slender. He oogled her as she settled into the tub in front of him. Her legs interlocking with his, she set the empty glass next to a bottle and grasped the metal tube, pulling it to her full red lips. He refilled the glass, barely taking his eyes off her as she inhaled deeply. Okay, so how about if you send me this new app of yours? She said, fingering her invisible-to-him lenses. He immediately located the program and sent her a copy. Instantly, she received it and began scanning her options. She took her time to make a decision. Sex with Eric had become boring, but maybe... She scrolled through the list of possibilities until she found one that made her smile. Eric watched her intently from the other side of the tub. He noticed her smile and wondered what romantic option she had chosen. Okay, she announced cheerfully. Let's do this. She was giggling as she began to raise herself out of the tub. No, not yet, Eric cooed, gently grasping her ankle, which was much thicker than it appeared. Let me help you bathe first. She giggled again and drew another breath from the metal tube in her hand. He caressed her, moving her invisible silky tresses away from her neck, then mashing his nose into it a bit, as it wasn't quite where he expected. She laughed again, as in her fantasy his long snout tickling her neck and made a snorting sound. She allowed him to rub a soapy sponge across her back and her front. It was hard for her to keep from giggling. Then, when he stood up, she couldn't help but laugh uncontrollably as her favorite childhood cartoon pig, Hinky, was standing over her with a gigantic erection. Come, my darling, he grunted while offering a cloven hoof for her to hold as she stood up. She accepted, and he carefully dried her dainty body with a white towel that had looked enormous before he began dabbing her with it. The two mammals moved to their extra-large bed, where Hinky began rooting around his side, leaning over its edge to reach a box that contained another narcotic-filled cylinder. Isabella spied his chubby pink ham hocks and couldn't help herself from sinking her teeth into the fluffy cheeks. The little piggy squealed shrilly, then wrestled the naughty Gigi to the mattress. They copulated, with Eric expertly thrusting Gigi as she had never been thrusted before, causing her to writhe and shout with ecstasy. "Oink, oink, motherfucker!" she squealed at the top of her lungs, all while laughing uncontrollably at the honks and farting noises that were coming from the animated pig that she was having cross-species sex with. Both ended their Friday night sex affair in complete satisfaction. Eric rolled onto his pillow, spent. But as he lay there thinking about the experience, he looked over at Gigi, who was also hugging her pillow, and asked, "Did I hear you say oink, oink?" he questioned timidly. Isabella shrugged. "I don't know," in that annoyed voice that warned him that further questions could be detrimental to his well-being. At her next session, Sally was remembering a nature hike that she had taken with Sophie in a wooded park that also had several small lakes and ponds. There were a labyrinth of trails. One day they chose to walk to an area where she had noticed several small stone sculptures. She had always assumed the person responsible for the whimsical piles carefully placed stones was an artist. She visualized the type of person who would spend hours near the beach and the forest quietly building their works of art. She was happy to find that person at work there one day. He was an old man with white hair and beard. He stopped working when he noticed her. They began a conversation about how lovely it was there near the water. He told her that he had lived in the area all his life, that he had swam regularly in the lake, that he and his friends still met there and swam together. She smiled and mentioned how nice it was that all the happiness was free. The man's eyes narrowed. "Free? It's not free. You have to pay taxes like me. I work 2 jobs. Sally was taken aback. She realized the man thought she was jobless, a brown vagrant with a shaggy dog. Instead of explaining herself, she walked away. Pondering the experience in her mind, she began to realize that the person that she wanted to meet because they were an artist was really an angry old white man marking his territory. "Are you saying that you'd never corrected the old man?" Dave asked after listening to her story. "No, he didn't deserve to know the truth. He didn't want to know the truth. He's probably one of the followers, someone caught in the Hive Mentality," she explained. Dave just wrinkled his brows. "What I mean," Sally continued, "is that there are people who work hard so that they can buy the stuff that the big corporations tell them they want. Whenever a new gadget comes out, they buy it without considering whether it's worth the time and that they spent making the money to pay for it. They work most of their waking hours, their entire life. Then they begin to believe that everyone should be like them, wasting their lives here on earth working for a corporate queen bee. They get mad and lash out at anyone who doesn't follow their work ethic. It's like they want the rest of the world to suffer with them." "Who are those that are not followers?" Sally sighed. It had been ages since she had had to explain this to someone. But she liked Dave and felt that he really wanted to know. "We are the deciders. We are the people who collect the information and make decisions. We are the culture that lives by logic, truth, and compassion." Dave quietly considered something that his other patient, Ollie, had said. All there is really is good and bad energy. So the old man, the follower, would represent the bad energy, and Sally, the decider, would represent the good. Sally sat back in her chair. "Besides, I was pissed," she admitted. "He thought that because of the way I looked, I was one of the replacements. There are still a bunch of old white people who are mad at not being the majority anymore. But you know, as far as the browning of America goes, if you look at the big picture, 200 years ago, whites probably were the majority. 300 years ago, Native Americans were the majority and had been for the previous 20,000 years. So in 1,000 years, when people look at a timeline of North America, the bit that represents white America will be a very small blip on the timeline. That's just the fact." She was frowning and raising her voice a little. Dave watched with relish. His despondent client was showing emotion. He was sure that this discussion was good for her, so he encouraged her on. What do you think the effects of America not being white anymore are? Sally thought for a minute. I look at it this way. Even when there are no blue eyes, blonde-haired people anymore, there are still the genes being swapped. Evolution dictates that we as an organism will take the best of each genome. The product of multiple race children will be a hybrid, taking the better genes with every exchange. The genes from people of Middle Eastern descent who invented mathematics will mix with that of Roman engineers. They will have the superior physique of an African hunter and the oneness with nature of the Native Americans. What we are doing here in North America is creating the next great civilization of superheroes. Dave chuckled. They both did. I think you're right, Dave announced. Sally was still a bit agitated on her walk home. She kept thinking about the old man and what she had said to him. Not that anything she had said would have converted him. She sighed. She looked sadly at Sophie's cushion before shutting the door. She sat down at her desk to check her messages. That was when she noticed one from Alvin. A smile crossed her lips as she read that he wanted to meet with her in an hour before the meeting. She answered in the affirmative. Guess I'm going to another meeting, she told herself in a happy voice. For Ollie's next appointment, Dave made a point of telling him about the visit from John Smith at the beginning of the session. He wanted to be sure that there was no misunderstanding. $250,000? Ollie wasn't as upset as Dave would have imagined. Is this something that's happened before with your grandson? Dave asked. Ollie let out a sigh. Not exactly, but it fits a pattern. I'm afraid my grandson has always been cold. It's like he doesn't seem to get close to anyone. I've tried. He's just interested in money and stuff he can buy with it. Finding out how much my business was worth seemed to put him on a mission. Ollie shook his head sadly. I just don't know what to do about it. What does your son think about it? Ollie sighed again. He doesn't understand it either. But to be honest, Steve's behavior, or I should say misbehavior, is why he ended up with me. He barely managed to complete high school. He was caught cheating. Then college was a disaster. He just wouldn't go to class. So he was sent to live with me, to learn a trade. At first I was all for it. In fact, I suggested it. Now I don't know. Dave felt sorry for the old man. He had heard the stories of many a parent and grandparent that felt a responsibility to their delinquent children at risk of their own well-being. Maybe Steve should be fired. Ollie looked up wearily. I just can't do it. I can't turn my back on the boy. I'm not made that way. Ollie looked away for a moment before continuing. I was a teenager when the cyber attack happened. That was how I ended up in construction. All of us, without electricity, no one knew what to do. So when a group was formed to help people by installing solar panels, I joined them. Learned a lot in a small amount of time, he chuckled. There were a bunch of us that became solar experts in a hurry, winging it most of the time at first. Those were some tough times for so many people. People were dying of heat stroke and dehydration by the thousands. It was so ugly. We survived it by becoming a community and helping one another. Dave nodded in appreciation. I bet you have some good stories. Oh, yeah, Ollie chuckled. That event is what brought the country together, no doubt. One of the things I often think about was my grandpa's car. He was a frugal old man, but just before the attack, he had financed a deluxe electric car. It was a beauty. He had enough money saved that he was able to keep up the payments even after the attack for a while. He was the last one in our neighborhood with a working vehicle, and because of a solar generator he had, he was able to charge it and keep it running. He became the taxi service for our little neighborhood. He took people to doctor's appointments, made long-distance runs for supplies, but then, with no income, he just couldn't keep up. So at first the neighbors pooled their money to make the payments, but then, as that became impossible, those same neighbors helped him hide it from the repo guys. Ollie and Dave both chuckled. They'd take turns hiding it in their garages. Well, that's a good socialist story, Dave laughed. Yes, the attack was vicious. It did cause an overnight change for this country. We needed one another. We helped one another. We appreciated our families and neighbors. I think it caused us to love our children more, maybe too much. I think we held them so tightly that we spoiled them. We just never wanted to see them suffer, so we overcompensated. Maybe that's what happened to Steve. We just loved him too much. Ollie was staring out the window as he finished the last sentence. Ollie's observations were on par with the experts that penned the online studies that Dave read. It seemed to be a widespread problem with the youth. With a new boom in the economy, parents and grandparents were spoiling them. After a moment of silence, Dave offered, "Do you really want to take these competence tests?" Ollie shook himself back to present. "Yes, I'm curious for myself. Steve might have a point. You never know." Dave admired the old man's open-mindedness. The rest of the session was used to complete the tests. Their results were no surprise to the counselor. Ollie had an especially high IQ and astuteness of someone half his age. Second peace meeting. Sally took extra time getting ready. She had even purchased a new blouse, makeup, and a lightly scented oil after a shower, and she was ready. She watched the scenery out the window as her vehicle made its way down the highway. The coffee shop was small and situated between two other businesses in the middle of a block. A projection of a cup of coffee being poured into an ornate porcelain cup filled the front window, but left in the background a clear view of the small white tables that filled the room inside. Sally could see the back of Alvin's head. There was a man sitting with him. Uncertain, she opened the door and meekly walked to their table. Alvin noticed her as she approached and stood up to greet her. "Hello, Sally," he said enthusiastically. Then he gestured towards the man across from him. "Sally, I'd like to introduce you to my partner, John." Sally tried to keep the smile on her face. Alvin pulled the chair out for her. Her heart was broken. She didn't realize how much she had been counting on this meeting. In her mind, it was going to be a date. She wanted to be mad at Alvin, but quickly realized that she had no reason to be. He was a nice man who recognized her as a leader and someone who could help the group. He was right. She tried to stay focused and interested in all that was said. He was hoping that she could help them promote their next march. Exactly what he had told her when he asked her to meet him for coffee. All she could think about was how pathetic she was, that there was probably a good reason she was always alone. She burst out crying on the way home. It had been all she could do to keep it from happening sooner. She remembered her last boyfriend. He kind of worked when they first met, but that job ended and soon he became more of a vagrant than a boyfriend. The one before that wasn't much better. She long ago admitted that she had terrible taste in men. It seemed to get worse after her mother died. Before that, every man she brought home had to pass the mom test. She missed her mom. She missed Sophie. She even wished that her stupid cousin would stop by and see her. Why was she alive again? She wondered. Oliver Wayne sat down at his computer with a cup of coffee, as was his morning routine. It was the end of the month, so he was balancing his bank accounts. It was his grandson Steve that had been put in charge of the accounts payable, so Ollie was also checking his work to make sure everything was in order. That was when he noticed a payment of $678.95 to a local tailor. He knew right away what that was about. Steve had already given him a salary of $5,000 per month, more than enough to pay his rent and other living expenses. Yet there he was, using his company account as though it was a personal account. Ollie sighed. He'd spoken to Steve last month and the month before about the same issue. He wondered if Steve thought his grandfather wouldn't notice the transaction or if he just expected him to ignore it. Ollie considered this for a moment. Then he came to an obvious conclusion that his grandson had expected him to ignore it. He was trying to wear his grandfather down. It would be easier to pretend not to notice, but it wouldn't be helpful to either of them. He clicked on an image on his screen that called Steve. Okay, Steve, why are you charging clothes on the company account? It's a business expense. Then take it as an expense on your taxes, but you need to pay back the company. Why? I'm not being paid enough to buy proper clothing. Why not let the company deduct it as an expense? Because that's not how it's done. I'll deduct it from your next paycheck, but don't do it again. Ollie hated being so firm, but he needed to show Steve how to run the business, and he needed to do it the right way. Steve ended the call. He was angry that his grandfather was so old-fashioned and didn't know what money was for. It was for spending. His grandfather was rich. Why not use the profits to enjoy life? It also angered him that he had to get permission to spend money from the company that he was to be in charge of. It was humiliating. He had been encouraging his grandfather to retire, but he long ago realized that it wasn't happening, at least not as soon as he'd prefer. The old man was healthier than most middle-aged men, and he didn't anticipate a funeral any time soon. Wait, that was it. He ruminated about this for a while. His grandfather was old. He'd lived a long, happy life. The best thing he could hope for now was a quick death, and Steve was supposed to take over the business. His parents were already on board. He was sure that his father would sign off any claim he had, as long as he wasn't involved in the death. Just a minute. Ollie was already standing on the little porch of the building that contained Dave's office when Dave arrived. The door was locked. Ollie, you are earlier than me. Sorry you had to wait. Dave stepped up and unlocked the door with his thumb. No problem. No problem, responded the good-natured senior. The truth was, Dave enjoyed his talks with Ollie as much as Ollie looked forward to the visits. They stepped into Dave's office and his comfortable chair. Dave was holding a tablet in his hand. Would you like to see your results from the test you took? Sure. Well, I took the liberty of checking your stats. You are in the top 5% of your age bracket. In fact, you are in the 12% top score for a man half your age. Mr. Wayne, I'm proud to tell you that you might just have an extremely high IQ. You could apply to be in Mensa. Ollie chuckled. I'm kind of disappointed to hear that. It means that our little talks won't be necessary anymore. Dave looked solemn for a moment. There's still the issue of your grandson. Ollie sighed. I'm just worried that he's caught up in that hive mentality. It's making him money hungry. He looked at Dave thoughtfully. I'm afraid that if I don't keep an eye on him, next he'll be embezzling from the company. Dave nodded. What is your plan if you catch him? Ollie thought about this a minute. Well, I've already caught him using the company account like his own piggy bank. I warned him. Ollie, I think you need to make a plan. Determine ahead of time what actions you will take if you catch him again. I looked around himself uncomfortably. I've been thinking about it. Ignoring the problem won't help anyone, including Steve. In fact, that's probably how the problem has escalated to the point it is now. Dave agreed and helped Ollie to set some limits. Then he turned the discussion to something lighter. So, are you going to post those test results on social media? Ollie shook his head. No, I only lie on social media, so no one would believe me anyway. Dave laughed. What do you mean? Well, just look. I've been 39 for the last 20 years. Dave laughed harder. Seriously? Sure, I always lie. I highly recommend it. It throws a wrench into the data collecting machine. No one needs to know what month you're born in, your marital status, your zip code. Fuck that. Not only are you giving away information that can be accessed when you are scanned with facial recognition software, but you are also adding to the profile the average age, weight, likes, dislikes, mostly to create profiles to control and market to the masses, individually and collectively. Fuck that. And the thing is, we all know that they are collecting our information on stats. We know what the average 30-year-old male is supposed to like and dislike, and this creates a giant feedback loop so that we are all working in harmony for the queen bee. That's why you should never be afraid to refuse to participate. If you are pressed to give away personal information, just fucking lie. Dave nodded. This made absolute sense to him. He didn't want this to be their last session, and neither did Allie. So they set up another appointment for the following week. Dave the counselor was patiently waiting for Eric Gunderson. He was late again. The last week he had canceled the day of his appointment. After an additional 15 minutes had passed, the outside door opened and there appeared Mr. Gunderson in primary green suit with matching hair tips that spiked up. Dave wondered how much he must look like the devil when he wore red. "Hello," Dave greeted his patient in a pleasant voice. Eric nodded and silently followed his counselor into the next room. They both took their usual seats. "One little thing before we get started today," Dave began. "I'm afraid I might have your payment information wrong since it didn't go through." Eric was stony-faced. "My bills are paid on a 30-day basis. You will have to wait until the end of the next month." Dave shrugged. "Okay." "So sorry to hear about your robbery. Is everything back in order for you?" Eric made an annoyed face. "They did find my car, but it had to be cleaned and repaired. They still haven't found the ruffians who stole it yet. As for me, well, just more bruises and a slight concussion. But I'm feeling good now." Dave looked thoughtful. "Did you get a look at them?" "No, they were using a disruptor. I couldn't see them." "Because you're wearing your AR lenses." Eric frowned. "Yes, but how could I help that? I need my glasses to work. I was composing an important message when they snuck up behind me." Dave nodded thoughtfully. "But wasn't your persistent wearing of the lenses one of your wife's complaints?" "Well, I do believe that she has grown more fond of them lately." Eric's voice trailed off as he had a faraway look that no one else could see. "Does your wife also wear them most of the time?" Again, Eric became a little distracted with memories of the prior evening. "She doesn't work, and for some reason she prefers the white walls." David didn't understand the answer. "Have you been sticking to my recommendation from our last meeting? Are you spending an hour a day without them?" Eric let out a sigh. Almost. In fact, he had only tried Dave's suggested exercise on 2 evenings in the last 2 weeks. It was agony. Nothing to do. Not only did his lenses provide the tools he needed for work, they were also his entertainment. He and his wife still had one large monitor attached to the wall in their living room, but he seldom used it, since he could watch movies and other entertainment directly onto his glasses. When he went out, the look-up functions that kept him informed about his surroundings had become such a comfort and an important part of his day-to-day existence that he felt a bit fearful without them. So his not wearing of the glasses only happened when he was home for the evening. "It's just that there is nothing to do without them," he admitted. "Did you ever consider reading a book?" Dave suggested. But Eric only stared in his direction with a "you've got to be kidding" expression. So Dave tried again. "Okay, then what did you do for the hour that you had them off?" "Well," Eric began, "I took them off for dinner one evening." He was remembering the incident. "Isabella thought that it was a good idea too, so she was all happy about it the first time." He remembered her mentioning how much she enjoyed looking at his eyes. "After dinner we watched a hologram performance of a new play." "Was it enjoyable?" "Not as much as it would have been if I had my glasses on. There was no background. The actors were just performing in the middle of our living room with the props that they had on stage with them. You couldn't tell where they were supposed to be, what year it was, and I really missed the little prompts that give you insights into what is going on that you wouldn't know otherwise. AR enhances everything. I just don't know why I'd want to be without my glasses. Dave listened thoughtfully. Eric's inability to turn off his technology was common. He decided not to mention to him that the hologram was also technology and that the exercise was supposed to be that he not use any tech for an hour. Was it easier the second time? Eric sighed again. That would have been the day I was robbed. Eric shook his head at the memory of the day. I don't remember ever feeling so vulnerable. I didn't even have a communications device. I had to ask an old man to call the police. Then being taken to the police station in the back of one of those stinking little electric cars of theirs like I was a criminal. It smelled like moldy old cheese. Then he started asking me for all this personal information that I didn't know, like my address, stupid identification numbers that no one memorizes anymore, and whoever knows what their phone number is. Why would they? So when we got to the police station, they just had me give them a thumb scan, and that gave them everything that they wanted anyway. I don't know why they waste their time with stupid questions in the first place. Okay, but let's back up a minute. Isn't the reason that you were robbed because you were wearing your AR glasses? Eric looked annoyed. Well, yes, they probably chose me because I was wearing lenses, but they had the disruptors. Those are illegal. Besides, why should any law-abiding people change their lives because of criminals? Doesn't that just mean that they won? Eric, your lenses are a tool, just like a communications device, a computer, a transporter. They are all tools. When you need to use them, you turn them on. When you are finished, you turn them off and put them away. You are clearly not doing this with your lenses. You have become addicted to them. I am not an addict, he protested in an angry voice. Then why can't you go an hour a day without them? Eric went silent, then finally admitted, but it's just so damn quiet without them. Just outside the city, at the end of a long paved driveway, an ancient cement block building with several coats of gray paint sat sweltering in the sunny afternoon. The closely cropped shrubs offered little relief from the heat. The open parking lot did offer a few charging pads, but the circle drive was not enclosed, causing the tall, smartly dressed patron to curse at the inconvenience. He also regretted that he was being forced to tow a gangly, medium-sized mutt on its leash with him. He stepped out of the transport, nearly forgetting the poor dog. A safety mechanism in the transport made a dinging sound that caused the distracted patron to turn around and retrieve the animal before its door closed. Inside the nearly vacant reception room, tinted windows with a comfortable breeze cooled the pair. Eric Gunderson found his way to a long black counter. A young man was busy on the other side, talking to a monitor that was turned away from the guests. Video cameras filled the wall behind him, each displaying a variety of dogs, cats, and a few other animals in rows and rows of cages. The man looked up at the new arrivals. There was a faint look of recognition and a frown. "Can I help you?" Eric handed the man the handle of the leash. "I want to return this." The man stood up. "You want to leave your dog with us?" "Yes. I bought him here a few months ago, but he's just getting too big and he's still not trained properly. It's too much trouble. I want a refund." "Refund?" the man repeated in disbelief. "We don't give refunds, and the shelter is full." He leaned in closer to the man. "He's not a puppy anymore. I'm afraid that leaving him here would be a death sentence," he confided. Eric just stared back at the man. "I'm sorry, but it's too expensive. What with having to pay a walking service plus all this stuff my wife bought for him, we don't have time for it." The man just stared at Eric. He remembered him. He remembered him coming in with his wife, the two of them looking for an animal that resembled the virtual reality pet that they had already had. After a few moments of silence, Eric clicked his tongue and impatiently turned his back to the man and walked out. The young worker opened a door that was built into the counter, then hunched down on his heels to examine the dog. The animal immediately began to lick his hand, nuzzling him with his pink nose. The attendant hugged the animal to his chest, trying to somehow compensate for the inevitable. He had worked in that shelter for 5 years, first as a volunteer and now as a paid employee, but he still hadn't adjusted to the terms. He let out a sigh, then sat on the floor, letting the dog get close and lick his face. There was some moisture near his eyes. Eric Gunderson was nearly 30 minutes late, but Dave did get his wish, as Eric was in a red suit with the top of his head all ablaze, and he did look just like the devil. "Ah, Mr. Gunderson, I was worried that you had forgotten about me today," Dave said with a good-natured smile. "I had an errand to run on the way here. Incompetent government employees," he muttered, walking past Dave and into his office. Dave could tell that it wasn't anything he wanted to talk about. "Do you feel that you made any progress this week?" Eric dropped into the chair with a sigh. "Yes, I even tried your meditation exercises." Dave was pleased. "Did the meditation help?" Eric tilted his head. "Maybe." "Great. I was thinking that we should start having your sessions with your lenses off." Eric looked at him confused. "Right now?" "Yes." He slowly reached up with both hands and gently removed the glasses. It was the first time his counselor had seen his eyes. "Wonderful," David cooed. "How do you feel?" "Naked." "Are your eyes sensitive to the light?" "They would be if we were outside, but in here it's okay." Eric shrugged, looking around himself as though the room was new to him. "Do things look different to you?" "A little." "How?" Eric was quiet a moment. "Well, after our first session, I had you looking a bit like a monkey," he admitted. Dave's eyebrows temporarily slipped under his bangs. "I'm joking," Eric added, but not very convincingly. They had what Dave considered a productive conversation that went over Eric's allotted time. Dave had to end it since his next client tended to be early. Eric promised to stay on his daily 1 hour without a visor schedule, a promise that he wouldn't keep. He returned the AR glasses to his face before stopping outside and summoning his transport. While he stood on the building's small porch for a moment, adjusting his lenses and checking for his messages that he had undoubtedly missed, an old man stopped at the bottom of the stairs, patiently waiting for Eric to move aside, as the porch was small and he was on his way up. It took several moments for Eric to comply, especially since he felt no reason to rush for the old man. "Thank you," old Ollie replied, not knowing how much of a favor the arrogant devil did for him. As below them, on the other side of the street, an ordinary-looking, middle-aged man was scanning them. He had his device aimed at Eric, but because of Eric's rubber software, the man had acquired Oliver Wayne's identification. "Bingo," the man said in a low voice. The anonymous service that he had worked for only gave him the mark's name and where he would be. It was up to him to locate him. And now that he had the old man's address, he'd be waiting outside his condo. He noted the man's distinctive AR lenses. His newly acquired disruptor would come in handy. Jose the Hitman was lurking inside the drive-thru of Eric's building. He was wearing a modest suit and sporting a shoulder bag of a similar make that many businessmen carried. His gray felt hat made him look as though he belonged in the lobby. Just another working guy. When he noticed Eric step out of the transporter, it was easy to be invisible with a disruptor in his pocket. He followed behind him. The way Eric tended to ignore everyone was well and good for Jose. Not one person greeted him with a hi or hello. He quietly stepped into the elevator after Eric had offered his thumb for the scanner. Once the elevator stopped, he followed his prey to his front door, where again Eric's eyes were scanned. The door opened. Jose walked briskly so that he could catch it before it shut. Eric didn't notice the delay in its shutting. He just continued into his living room. Jose slipped into the kitchen when he noticed Isabella sitting on a couch, being entertained by some kind of medium who was sitting at a small table in the center of the living room. When she turned her head to acknowledge her husband, Jose was relieved to see a similar style of AR lenses on her face. "Darling, come here and have your fortune read," she said, with more enthusiasm than Eric was used to. He feigned interest and stepped around the couch so that he could sit beside his wife. Eric kissed in the air between them. Then the two of them watched a hologram gypsy with tarot cards spread out on a table in front of her. "She told me that I would soon be having a life-altering experience that would put me on a better path," she explained. "I think she's talking about my joining the Arts Council. Maybe we will soon be having little soirees here with artists and influential people," she gushed. "Have her tell your fortune, dear." Eric studied the hologram as the fortune teller was arranging the cards in front of her. She had an olive skin and long dark hair. Her outfit was of a classical gypsy type, complete with a colorful headscarf and full ankle-length skirt. Many rings, bracelets, and necklaces glittered from her person. He wondered if she was being paid by the hour or by the fortune, but he didn't want to make Isabella angry by asking. "Sure," came his curt reply. "Well, let me see," she said as she rearranged her cards, then looked back up at him. "I can tell that you are a businessman." She was an interactive hologram, which meant that somewhere there existed her real-life counterpart that could see Eric, and therefore her deduction was not too impressive. Jose was still in the kitchen, peeking around the corner and wondering if the hologram might tell on him if she saw him. He was trying to decide if she could see him or not. It made him uncomfortable that she wasn't wearing lenses. He wondered how far her range of vision was. Interactive holograms usually only had a small viewing area, only able to see a few feet around themselves. Many people made their living this way, offering services from their home by way of hologram. "I see that you are working on an important project." At these words, Isabel elbowed Eric and squealed, "I bet she's talking about the property that you want Daddy to buy," she offered excitedly. But Eric wasn't impressed. "Ah, yes, it has something to do with real estate," the gypsy elaborated. Isabella poked Eric in the side again. "See, isn't that good?" Eric rolled his eyes as soon as his wife returned her gaze to the hologram. "What happens? Does the deal work out?" Isabella asked enthusiastically. The gypsy paused for a moment, then rearranged her cards again in a thoughtful way. "Not sure. Depends on another transaction. Some unknown factor could come up." She reshuffled the cards and arranged them in front of her again. "If this other transaction is successful, then no, but it's not clear yet." "What should he do?" Isabella pressed. "Well, I'm not sure that there is anything he can do," the medium stated. "I guess we'll have to wait and see." Eric could stand it no longer. "So, you are using your prophetic powers to tell me that you don't know?" He wanted to add that this act was among the worst scams that he had ever witnessed, but held his tongue, fearing that he had already committed a sin with this hint of disbelief. "Honey, give Miss Clarice a chance to finish," his wife scolded. "Well, one thing that I can tell you is that you will know by the end of the day," she exclaimed. "Groovy," Eric stated dryly before standing up. He looked down at his frowning wife. "I'm sorry, honey, but I have to make a call." Then, with a sudden inspiration, he added, "Maybe this call will give me the answer that I'm supposed to get by the end of the night." She smiled up at him. "Let me know." Eric walked around the couch, headed for the balcony. He briskly stepped past Jose, who was pushing himself against a counter. Then the two slipped through a sliding glass door. Eric pulled it closed securely behind him. He didn't like anyone hearing his conversations. The evening was cool. He could see a pink sunset still peeking out above the tall buildings that adorned his vista. This was his favorite place, his favorite view. So it was serendipitous that it should be his last. Jose was quietly at work, opening his bag and pulling out a needleless syringe, already full of a poison that was so toxic that Eric wouldn't have time to react to the pressure on the side of his neck. His mind only briefly wondered what it could be. He didn't even get a chance to explore it with his fingers. He just dropped to the ground, dead. Jose quickly returned the syringe to its place in his bag. Then he scanned Eric's body again for his vital signs or lack of it. With the first part of his mission a success, he quietly returned to the kitchen to resume his former place, that he might get a peek at Isabella. She was still discussing the future with her fortune-teller. Exiting would be easy. No thumbprint was necessary to exit the condo or return to the ground floor on the elevator. The only thing left to do was collect his pay. The electronic transfer was done in the alleyway behind the complex. Jose simply had to send the file of information from the 2 body scans and the temporary address of the benefactor, and now he was $100,000 richer. Ollie had been early for his appointment with Dave, as usual, but as he had approached the tiny porch outside the door, there had been a man dressed like the devil standing on the porch and blocking the entrance. Ollie was a bit annoyed, watching the man silently poking in the air with no sense of civility. He wanted to interrupt, yet the humble man inside him told him to be patient and just wait to the side until the man was finished. He was early, he reminded himself. Inside he found Dave with his office door open, reading a book that Ollie had recommended. "How do you like it?" he asked in a chipper voice. "I do. I just finished reading about the crime, and for some reason hoping that the murderer doesn't get caught. Or that the whole thing was a bad dream. How do you feel about it?" "Well, I don't want to ruin it for you, but I can say that I didn't want him thrown into the gulag either, even though he was an arrogant son of a bitch." "I know," Dave enthusiastically agreed. "I guess that there have always been people who felt that they were above the law, even when it comes to murder." Dave placed the book on his desk and led Ollie to their comfortable chairs. "So tell me, how are things going with your grandson?" Dave had waited until they were both settled in before asking. "Good," Ollie replied in a happy voice. "I don't know if I actually had an impact on him when I told him that he needed to straighten up or what, but he's been very civil to me since I laid the law down on him about his spending." "Great to hear." Dave did feel relieved and hopeful. "Just don't forget the agreement we made last week. He could be setting you up." Ollie nodded solemnly. "I know." "So then, was there anything else on your mind?" Dave asked after a few moments of silence. "Politics," Ollie admitted. Dave shrugged. "Okay, it's your session." Ollie chuckled. "Well, I noticed in the paper today that some numbskull from coal country is pushing to repeal the new plastic tax from their state." Dave gasped. "I hadn't heard about that. Can they do it?" Ollie shook his head. "They are giving it a good try. They don't even have their damn oil and fracking projects back online yet, and they are already looking at a way to produce cheap plastics again. That would throw a wrench into our reclamation plants in the rest of the country, and it would destroy the profits made from the reclamation ships out there right now cleaning up the debris in islands out in the middle of the ocean. And they are just starting to make enough money to make the whole project feasible. I'm just sick over it." Dave shook his head in sympathy. "Hopefully it will be rejected, for the good of the planet, if nothing else." "I just don't understand those people," Ollie continued. "You know, the ones who waste their time here chasing profit? They would destroy all just to feel that they had won at the game in their last turn. I mean, what are they going to do if they are successful at destroying the planet? They'd be destroying the place where we like to play, all of us. Adventurous souls who like the action, the sensation of living here in any of the Earth's forms. It would be a sad day for all the souls, that day when the termite people are successful." Dave nodded in agreement. He understood Ollie. He was one of the adventurous souls himself. "Okay, Ollie, we need to make a decision here," Dave said in a stern voice that reeked of levity. "Either we make another hour-long session for you next week, Or you quit being my client altogether, and then we could meet in the evenings over dinner and discuss literature. Eily looked thoughtfully. Well, I suppose I'd prefer the latter. Dave smiled and turned his tablet off. How about next week at 7 instead of 3? Ollie was at home, descending a circular stairway in his bedroom that gave him access to the office below. The staircase was added, but the house was ancient. His office, that still contained the wainscot and covered the bottom half of the wall, was made of beautifully polished cherry wood. There was a heavy wooden desk at its center. It looked out at the glass wall of a turret. He kept the lace curtains pulled back, that he might be able to watch the wildlife out of the window while he worked. He poured himself a cup of coffee from a small service and sat at a table. There was an assortment of cups and condiments. He fixed his cup of coffee, took a biscuit out of a tin, and set it on the side of his saucer. He stood at the window at the turret to admire the view before sitting down at his desk. He turned on the monitor and read the morning paper, as was his custom. Man killed in his own home while wife is unaware, was one of the headlines. Ollie mused. Those damn AR lenses, he said aloud before moving on to the next article. After reading the paper, he opened his business account ledger, immediately gasped at the balance. A credit to his account of $250,000 stood out. He looked at the transaction carefully. It was a money transfer to another account. There were only 2 people that could have done that, and he knew that he hadn't. He sat holding his head in his hands, staring at the screen. He ran his fingers through his hair. He and Steve had been getting along so good lately. Was it all just to butter him up? He asked himself sadly. Then the words of his friend came to him. He could be setting you up. He knew what he needed to do. He clicked a red button on his screen and ordered his computer to call the police. Waking up in the morning after crying yourself to sleep is kind of like a hangover. Sally's eyes were sore, her nose was stuffy. She had a slight headache, but she was alive, and it was the day of her weekly appointment with Dave. It was the reason she woke up. Dave was now her only friend, she admitted to herself in the mirror, and she was paying him to listen. This would be her last appointment, she decided. She opened the medicine cabinet and took out a bottle of pain pills that her mother's name on them. They were old, but there were enough of them to do the trick. She had been saving them. First she thought that she would take them after her mother's funeral, but it was at the little funeral that her cousin Eve had told her that she wanted to move in, so the bottle stayed on the top shelf. Then Eve moved out, leaving behind her dog. Sally had to take care of Sophie. They became best friends, but now Sophie was gone too. She set the bottle back on the top shelf. She'd do it after her appointment, she decided. She got to her appointment at the regular time. Her eyes were red, but a cold, wet rag had reduced the swelling. Dave could tell that there was something wrong. She had turned into a robot again, he noted. When he asked her how the peace group meeting had gone, he was expecting an account of her coffee shop meeting, but instead she explained to him what they had discussed. Did you get a chance to meet with Alvin beforehand? He asked, with genuine interest. Yeah, we did. It was productive. She didn't want to relive it, so she just added, he's a nice gay man. Dave sighed. He knew she was expecting something else. He was worried for her and could tell that she wasn't ready to talk about it. He tried to focus on her future plans. Was she interested in becoming involved with the local politics, running for office maybe? But he just couldn't bring her back, get her interested in anything. She was despondent, and he knew that he was her only flesh and blood conduit to the outside world. Her problem was widespread. We have become so solitary with small families where the family members are never permanent, and most of our friends are nearly imaginary people that we only know online. We have become an isolated group of socially awkward mammals. It wasn't natural. It wasn't healthy. Sally could tell that Dave was worried for her, so she made herself smile and tried to appear pacified. She didn't want her last meeting to end with an unpleasant note. So she pretended that it wasn't the last, that she was more than the zombie that she felt like on the inside. She realized that it would probably be Dave that alerted the authorities that something was wrong when she didn't show up for her meeting, but she would be sure to post his ad everywhere before she turned off the computer for the last time. She cared for Dave. He was her only friend. She felt a compulsion to hug him before she left. It was the first time. The walk home was solemn. She told herself that she should splurge on a last dinner. She wandered the streets looking for a place to eat, but nothing seemed appealing when your depression takes your appetite, so she gave up the search. Then, as she was walking down the sidewalk towards home, she sees a young man with a dog talking to a small group of people. She makes eye contact with the dog. It made her think of Sophie. But then, as she was passing the small group, she heard what the dog walker was saying to the people as they stopped to reach down and pet the dog. "I work at the shelter. He is due to be euthanized today if no one adopts him." Sally was stung by the words. She stopped and looked at the youthful adult dog. In her mind, she was getting closer, but in reality her feet were frozen while she watched helplessly as the man takes a few steps away from her. Then the dog turned and glanced at her as the man is urging him forward. Suddenly, she blurts out in a voice louder than she intended, "I'll take him."